Good morning, everyone. I spoke with a few of you, and one I know from a summer school I organized on energy transition, to have an idea on who you are and where I stand from. But my background is in international relations theory and security studies, and environmental security is one of the fields in that sphere. And what I will try to do, I'm not sure whether you had a chance to read the articles that I recommended to you, or glance them through at least, to have an idea of what I tried to problematize here. And so we will split up at some point in subgroups. We are now at 20 people, so probably 5 groups will be a good idea. And we will discuss various aspects of that. My presentation will relate to that in a more general sense, and please interrupt me if you have any questions or you want some elaborations. I don't care if this runs completely different than I had originally planned it. In IR we study anarchy and we practice it also a little bit, so there's no reason to stick to the format as it is, but let's see where we go. Where do I come from? Here, this is a cartoon from 1993 showing things which I think are still topical. And that's something I like to start with. It's not new, perhaps, certainly not to newer generations. You think, oh, we all of a sudden discover climate change and we all of a sudden discover other things. It's a debate that goes on since the 1970s and even a bit earlier, Silent Spring with Rachel Carson in the 1960s, where the environment as such made its entry into the political and social sciences and in politics and society as well. It's a bit sad that I still have to show this. This is roughly when I started to teach on environmental security and all the problems: water quality, air quality, natural habitat, global climate is there, native species, etc., all on this slope of human population growth, which is one of the basic problems. It's still there. So that's the bad news, it's still there. The good news is we're still here. So in that sense, we apparently still have time to work on it. I was working on it in in this project, The World at the Crossroads. Dramatic picture on the front, another dramatic picture on the back. Both types of society struggling with the problems of that time. I can pass it around if you're interested. It was organized, by the way, by a natural scientist here at the University of Groningen, Phil Smith. I don't know anyone recalls him. That's a pity. He was a very flamboyant academic, and he organized this in the context of an international movement called the Puck-Wash movement. That's a movement of academics who are concerned about nuclear warfare. That's where it started from. And then later on they discovered, well, what if nuclear war does not occur? What kind of world do we have then? And that's what we are discussing nowadays. What's the quality of life? How do we treat each other? And how do we relate to the rest of the environment? We are, of course, part of that same world. The World at the Crossroads, it was an interdisciplinary project involving economists, natural scientists, chemists, political scientists, lawyers, all these kind of things. So you're saying, yes, here we have the academic power together to really make a difference. We can combine our insights and energy, and well, the book was grossly neglected. But there is a whole industry since the 1980s already of publications in this field. So the environment is hot in that sense, and it's a production line almost. You have activist groups who are working on it, civil society organizations, NGOs, universities, firms have nowadays almost always a kind of sustainability department to at least answer nasty questions. And so a lot is happening. You can read in the article I wrote on the development of this discourse that there is something interesting happening, that in the early 1990s we were dealing with the environment as a kind of a whole. It was embracing all these problematics, and politics has not really picked up on that. And there's good reason, not because the problems have been solved, but because they're too complex. Politicians like to point out to problems noticed by scientists or by themselves or by religious leaders or by whoever, but they like to point out at the problem, but then also point to the solution. Say, that's the problem, follow me, I'll show you the way out. It's always this kind of linkage that you find in public debates. And just showing, well, world population growth is a time bomb, and then say, and what can we do about it? Nothing. We have to sit and wait. Or do we have a UN policy for that? Or shall we all adopt the Chinese policy of one child? And how to enforce that? Who should do that? And how do I win elections with something like that? In China, they didn't have to follow that track. So, and how effective can it be? And so, a huge problem like that can be addressed by us, academics, public debate, etc. But we don't have solutions. And so it's typical for the contemporary debate on environmental issues and sustainable society that... Welcome. It's quite an entry. Okay. But it's less clear how you should translate these troubles into concrete action, where you can give a positive message to you as an audience and say, if we all invest in these things, then we can turn the tides. And so what happened historically is that the debate more and more gets split up in parts. But that's perhaps also good news, because if you split it up in parts, they might become more manageable and more concrete. That's why I asked you to read things about the Paris Agreement of last year, and to say, well, how do you, join here at this table. You're so far away, but there are empty chairs. Welcome. So I asked you to look at the results of the Paris Agreement and the decision of last year to see how should we evaluate this. Is this a big leap forwards, as the political leaders at that time made us believe, or should we evaluate it more critically? How to put this in perspective? And well, I gave you two related articles to that, one on the IPCC and the value of academic knowledge as a background in these kind of policy debates, and the other one on the role of cities, to which I will also comment at some point. The bottom line has been known for a very long time in environmental security. It's about the carrying capacity of the Earth, and that's defined by Paul and Anne Ehrlich, a nice couple who've been writing a lot about this already since the 1970s, as the total patterns of consumption that the Earth's natural systems can support without undergoing degradation. That sounds very good. It's a kind of a benchmark, so you can then look at concrete developments and say how this works. This is a global story, but it's also a local story. You also have a carrying capacity of the city of Groningen, or you have a carrying capacity of your own village, or it depends a lot on how you use resources, where they come from, and how you make your living. Also from the old days is this equation, I is EAT. It's not a misspelled iPad, but might be a way to remember easily what I mean. Environmental impact is it a product, or some academics are completely unsure about this, but these are the ingredients. Population pressure, affluence, that's living styles, and technology. These three things have a major impact on the final equation, environmental impact. In the Paris Agreement, you now hear about the logic of circular economy. Someone knows what that means, circular economy? waste, yeah. Yeah. Recycle, there, reuse.
Closing loops.
Closing loops. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that that everything indeed starts with a cycle, so that as I mentioned, like
okay, so you might have to make sure that what comes in also comes out at some point.
The system.
And not much is, well, you create some surplus value if you're happy, and then you reuse the things you put in. So reduce, reuse, and what was the, and so it's about these kind of things. But it's easier said than done. That's focusing perhaps on the technology side. A lot of efforts nowadays go into technology side. The affluence is a tricky one, and the population pressure as well. That has to do with the global dimension of environmental security, which in its essence is north-south. It's economic divide. You find it back in, it's also a demographic divide more and more, and it's an elite versus masses dimension, which you find throughout all the debates. This has to do with a paradox. I always like this one. In order to preserve our affluent lifestyles, it's necessary to change them fundamentally, given their unsustainability. That's a puzzle already since the Brundtland report from 1987, just preceding the birth of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it goes back to that period, late 80s, that people said we need to have a sustainable society, and this is the problem that we are facing. Are you willing to leave your present lifestyles if that saves the planet? Of course, in theory we all are, but in practice, how do we do that? So what we try to do is the opposite. We try to give a Western lifestyle to everyone on the planet, which might be quite hard to achieve. So there is a tension between different things, sustainability, equity and livability. Who's to pay the price today to avoid that others have to pay a higher price tomorrow? That's the same kind of paradox. And of course we are willing to pay the price, provided that our analysis is correct and that we know, okay, if we change this, then it will lead to that result. That's where science comes in. That's where we want to know how to calculate these kind of moves. If we talk about climate change, how sure are we that it will occur? And if it does occur, will our measures help or not? Does it help that we have wind farms here in the north of Groningen? Or is that just a kind of cosmetics in a much larger picture, which is completely irrelevant? Welcome. There are some chairs there left as well. Yeah. So we are a bit in the dark here, and we want to trust on science to predict the future for us. In the past, in the Middle Ages, we would probably go to the Pope. He had a short time to the Christian God and could inform us about the future, therefore a bit better than we could, or we could pray ourselves and ask for. Nowadays we look to science and scenarios and predictions, and everyone always said, oh, scenarios are no predictions and we can be wrong, but then they come with a best case, a worst case, and something in between, which will probably be then what we will end up with. We need that. It's improvement, it's good. At the same time, we need to be very skeptical and very critical about these practices, because we indeed don't know how to predict things. And in practice, we are skeptical, because we are only willing to pay a price if the story is convincing enough. If the narrative is such that we say, yes, we have no choice, we have to do this. This is for our grandchildren, it's not for me, but so I will give in, etc. So it's that kind of attitude which is very hard to mobilize with people, also given the complexity of the things, because of this north-south divide. Does this work? Yeah. Oh, I can only point at this one. Because of this north-south divide, if we want development in Africa and the rest of Asia, more in Latin America, etc., etc., and we have our levels of affluence as the ideal there, then how do we match that with how we should change our behavior? It's a very complex story, and we have to look at it. There are roughly 3 positions in this debate. Are you aware of these three? Does someone know what is? You should know. I told him, I used the same slide in our summer school on energy transition, but there were so many things there. But let me refill it. There are three approaches, basic things. First is neo-Malthusians, related to this idea of population growth in relation to other things that we need. It will simply go wrong. Sooner or later, there will be a major crisis. It can be disease, it can be war. Disease is generally worse than wars when it comes to victims and numbers. It can be all kinds of things, but at some point it will be unsustainable. Population pressure will lead to change. Then the question is, can we more or less steer this process, or are we just waiting and see what's happening? Again, this can also be applied to smaller settings. In urbanized areas, like here, we are dependent on all kinds of structures, infrastructures. Your energy comes from somewhere, your food comes from somewhere, your water comes from somewhere. This is true for all urbanized areas around the globe. And if you disrupt them, well, you're lost. So you cannot fall back to subsistence farming as you can do in rural areas. So you have somehow to survive in that setting. So the Malthusian logic as such is disputed widely by demographers, and they think it's wrong and it's overestimations, and so far historically it has been proven wrong. But it's one of the points of view you find around. The other thing is distributionalists. People who simply say there is enough on this earth to share, but we don't share it. And so the challenge is, how can we create systems of production and redistribution which are more equal? Well, you immediately see the difficulties arising here, because it depends a lot on your political position, how you define equal. Is that conservative, liberal, equal idea, or socialist, or is it? How do you play around with that? So there is a lot of debate. What is fair distribution? We have monetarized all these things, so the economy is dominant here. And if we think, oh, let's give more of our overproduction to Africa, economically that's dumping. You destroy the local markets. You flow them with our extra products and make competition even more hard than it is already. So it's a very complex thing. Distribution is not just giving away your wealth and then, well, you might feel happy, but it doesn't change the structure. And so distributionalists talk about the structure of the world economy. They talk about the structure of our social ideas, cultural ideas, etc. And it may take a few more centuries before we are there, but it's one of the tracks. And perhaps we have time. Then finally, we have the economic optimists who say, oh yes, we have problems. We had problems in the past, but we will find something. So if we don't have enough rubber, we make synthetic rubber. And if we are running out of oil and gas, we will develop solar and wind. And if we run out of coal or it's too much polluting, we will capture the CO2 emissions and store them somehow, and then our next generations will be smart enough to solve that problem, because if we are smart enough to solve the problems of our previous generations, etc., etc. So it's that kind of logic. And well, sometimes I fear we have no choice but to put our money on them, especially if it's money. Because it's economic optimism, and but at the same time we all feel a bit uncomfortable with that. Well, that was the situation, that is the situation, and we keep talking about it. Now one of the questions is, how serious is this all, and how should we evaluate this? What we normally do is then look at science and ask for answers, and so what are the threats, what are the risks, etc. Now something peculiar is at stake. Oh yes, I will come back to that. It's all caught in state-centric thinking. Something peculiar is at stake when it comes to security. It's a bit of a sidetrack here, and I might waste all my time that I've left, but I will nevertheless talk a bit about it. We tend to perceive security as some kind of objective, established threat that we have to deal with. Whereas we know from international relation theory and from social sciences more general, this is not the case. We don't know what security is. We don't know that it's the absence of something, but it's a very strange word. If we say, are we secure here? We immediately start thinking about threats. Is this safe? And then, okay, we might feel well assured, but given earthquakes in Groningen, are we sure? And so the word security, raises all kind of threat perceptions. You automatically start wondering from how stable is this ground? And so and this is exactly what it does in security discourses. It's in principle about how actors relate to each other in terms of threats and vulnerabilities, but who defines these threats and vulnerabilities? Of course, when an earthquake takes place now, we are in an immediate crisis and we have to run out somehow. This can happen orderly or not, and that's why for fire, for example, people have drills, and there might be a fire exercise that we have to leave orderly. It changes also social orders, because then people with yellow shirts will enter, and they all of a sudden have more power than anyone else in the room. And so it has all kinds of consequences, but we can work with these drills. But how serious should we take it when the threat is not immediate? There are a lot of threats that we simply live with. I guess you're all happy to go home today on your bikes or cars in traffic. And if there is someone of you who has agoraphobia, doesn't want to be on the public space, so to speak, we say, well, I'll go to a psychiatrist, please. It's not that dangerous out there. It is dangerous out there. It's much more dangerous out there than in many other situations. How many people die in traffic in the European Union yearly basis? Anyone a wild guess? How many people die of terrorism in the European Union? Anyone a wild guess? Well, terrorism, it might be perhaps 100 in a bad year. Traffic, structurally 42,000. Violent death. Young people, old people, losing their lives before they would normally have done. Because of the traffic. We have a structural problem here. But we live with it. Of course, we take some measures, and we're not allowed to drink, and you have a safety belt, and all that. But that's all cosmetic in relation to the structural figures, which are there with us for decades. USA, similar kind of figures. We accept such kind of threats and risks as a normal fact of life. Whereas other facts and risks we do not accept as normal facts of life. Terrorism is one of them. We need a global war on terror. And environmental security is an interesting one in that realm. So who puts it on the agenda as a security threat? Or do we live with it? Will we simply cope with 2 degrees more on average, meaning 5 degrees more in cities, and all the problems related to that? Will we simply live with the pollution, and or do we securitize it, put it on theory? There's a theory developed by this nice guy. He looks a bit older now, but on the internet you still find a nice picture. Ode Lever. The idea is that we have to think about the nature of security, and also even the nature of threats. Some look objective. Well, the risk assessment can be objective in some cases. Risk is chance times damage. What is the chance that an earthquake will occur? What's the damage if it occurs? If you make that equation, then you can say, oh no, we don't have to worry on average. Can happen, it's a very small chance. So traffic has a different kind of risk calculation, etc. So you can make these calculations. So you can more or less, in some cases, establish an objective threat. In the case of terrorism, it's already completely impossible, because we don't know. Is there any Breivik around here? I can't tell. You can't tell. Will he enter? You can't tell. You simply don't know. So you work in the completely in the dark, and I always have to laugh a lot when we say, we now go to code orange, and then we go to code red, and then we never go to code green. As a government, you can never say, oh, we're safe. And it has nothing to do with objective threats, it has to do with assessments, narratives, these kind of things. The same is, of course, a debate with climate change, where we say, how serious is it? Is it human-made or not? Can we change it, even if it's human-made? So should we focus on the effects, or should we focus on the causes? And what do we do in the meantime? Because the discussion is going on for decades already and nothing has happened. Not much. We're still on the same curve if you look to the statistics. And so it's in that context that you have to question yourself, well, this is the complexity. How does science come in here? Well, formally, I now already have to stop talking, as I expected I would be a bit out of time with it. So you have to, perhaps you can come back after your group discussions also a bit to how this works out in the environmental sphere. Security is a speech act. Politicians use it. Non-governmental organizations use it. Academics use it. And it says, well, watch out. And as soon as you say, watch out, you change the mode of attention. If it's just a problem, we can discuss it, take it with us in politics, and balance things. Well, one of the problems for the environmental agenda in relation to other types of securitization is that this is all in the hands mainly of an international state system. And in that state system, we are now looking in Paris at what are the states doing about this problem. But these states have to balance other security concerns as well. And that's where things run a bit more complex. So that leads to an analysis about how we should balance these factors. How should we balance the value of a report of the IPCC in relation to events in the Crimea or in geopolitical concerns about Turkey or Syria, etc. For states, they have to do something with that, and we will see in practice that normally the state-centric agenda overturns the others. So the environmental agenda, the climate change agenda, is still an add-on dimension to their standard concerns. And this is true for most aspects in world society, and if I can just say, we are looking for alternatives there. Not just for the state system, we cannot change that. That would be a bit arrogant to say, oh, we don't like this structure, let's pretend there is another one. No, it's there. So we have to work with that. And that's one of the questions I have for you in the group decisions. How happy or how sad should we be with the Paris Agreement in that respect? You have read a bit about it. And I'm curious to hear your opinions on how we should evaluate that. What does it trigger? What does it do with our general concerns about climate change? And how does it relate to the other security agendas that we are faced with, and especially in the state system we are faced with? The other question is the authority of science in this debate. What can we do with the authority of science in a debate about climate change? Well, to give you, I have to skip this, I think. No, isn't that true? I look at our director, but if you want me to, I can just briefly explain you a bit how we are looking for an alternative. We try to see more and more the state action as something that is not the dominant game, but is one of the games that we are facing. We have, of course, the civil society alternatives, but they're all sort of the same thing. I cannot show you now this nice website of Worldometers, but I recommend you to have a look at it. It presents a lot of the environmental data on a global scale, where you can just see how what the global context is of what we are facing. It gives you facts and figures on population growth, on desertification, on oil use, on obesitas and healthcare problems, on poverty and hunger, on all these kind of globally available data. And then the question is, what do we do with that in practice? Well, in practice, we are stuck with this question. We have on the one hand individuals, on the other hand we are living in a world society. This sounds perhaps a bit too Western, individuals as the basic unit of analysis, but let's accept it for a while. 7.4 billion, if we have counted them correctly, together somehow form a world society. And at present we analyze that in terms of identity groups, families, tribes, classes, gender. Gender is not even mentioned here, so that's just to provoke probably. Sovereign states is another way of how we are organizing ourselves. International organizations related to these kind of sovereign things. Markets, the economic side of the coin, transnational corporations. And then finally, this world society. This is how we at present are dominantly filtering our ideas of world politics. We somehow try to mold it and understand it in these categories, which is mainly an identity discourse. Who are we? Who are you? Sometimes it's linked to the sovereign state. A sovereignty discourse, which is extremely strong, and an economic discourse, which might perhaps even be stronger. And the climate discussions that we have are somehow caught up in this scheme. And what we try to work on at this moment in our department is to see whether another reality, which is outside of this story, is not yet, should be present as well. And that's the distinction between people living in rural areas and in urbanized areas. That's a distinction that runs, quite across this one, and tells you, well, whatever it is what we do, more than half of the world population lives in urbanized areas at the moment, and that will increase considerably. And they are dependent on all kinds of infrastructural systems and structures, networks, that are not in the present equation. Because normally we only have a market discourse there, with all its unsustainable aspects, transnational corporations and sovereign states who have to do this. And so one of the questions we are facing at the moment is, can we have a different kind of interpretation if we put cities central rather than secondary? You have read the article on the role of cities in the COP21, the COP21 agreement in Paris. And it's secondary. It's, oh yes, cities are also important and they have to do a lot. They have to have their national act together, etc., and work in that vein. We could also turn it around. So we need a COP22 or a COP23 perhaps, because in November the 22 is already scheduled in Marrakesh. To turn it around and say, no, let's start with cities and rural areas. And let's then define our problems and solutions. And then see what kind of securitizations and prioritizations will emerge from that agenda, which is a different look at it. And therefore I think this dominant scheme is perhaps the myth that we need to be busted either by ourselves or it will be busted by future developments.